I've just put everybody on mute just so we're all good. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming this morning. And my name is Andrea Dees, and I serve as the Interim System Diversity Officer for Minnesota State's Office of Equity and Inclusion. And together with my team and the panelists this morning, we do want to wish you greetings, and we want to say a very warm welcome and thank you for attending this morning's first of our competency series of developing an institutional anti-racist framework. I do want to note that I want to give credit and maybe a little shout out to our ASL interpreters that will be on the screen throughout the presentation. We are broadcasting live, and this will also be recorded, and this webinar will be uploaded on the OEI, or Office of Equity and Inclusion website, at the culmination of the webinar. Today, we are really excited to present this information to you and to also have an opportunity to engage with you around what it means to have and implement and embed an anti-racist framework as a system, but also more importantly on our campuses. And so to that end, I will go ahead and start our presentation. For today's agenda, we're going to try our best to stick to this time limit, but we know that we have such rich information, so bear with us if we go a little bit over. But this is our intended agenda for this morning. We will start out with just giving a brief overview of what an anti-racism framework looks like, and then spend some time looking at the foundations of systemic anti-racism. And then we'll go into discussions with respect to campus perspectives from St. Cloud State University, St. Cloud Tech, Community and Technical College, Minneapolis College, and St. Paul College. And I'm excited to have been working with my co-panelists today for some time. They come with a broad and rich experience and expertise at their campus level, but also at the communities that they serve. And so without further ado, I will go ahead and move forward. Just to kind of give you a perspective and a foundational base of why we're even talking about this. As you know, one of the key pieces that we are focusing on as a system, as Minnesota State system, is the issue of ensuring that all of the students that come through our institutions are succeeding at every level. And Equity 2030 really speaks to that moonshot guiding principle. And the idea around Equity 2030 is really to come to a zero-sum gap of academic gaps and academic success for all students, particularly our marginalized students, by 2030. It's a huge moonshot, but we are committed to really giving it our all and looking at all of the systems that are incorporated in moving forward and moving the dial to get us to this moonshot goal. So today we're looking at really understanding some foundational work that can be incorporated within all of these aspects of what's necessary to move the dial, whether it's enhanced access, whether it's academic success, student engagement, looking at data from an evidence-based inquiry, financial resources, or how we come into this space from a workforce and talent diversity perspective. So these are all very important components for Equity 2030, but without understanding how we define what's systemically causing barriers for moving forward with this. That's what we're really here to talk about today, and how we can always incorporate that within our frameworks of strategic initiatives and strategic thinking and movement and operationalizing this work as well. So if you've come to any of our previous webinars, we always try to start off with level setting the language that we're using throughout the webinar. So to that end, we want to just share a few common language and key definitions that we've incorporated into our space and continue to evolve in this space. And we always incorporate perspectives and are always aware of the different perspectives, because in this space of equity and diversity and inclusion, it is actually an imperative for us to think about how words matter, how words have a strong and definite meaning, but how they can be interpreted as well. So we just want to make sure we're just level setting from that standpoint. These are just a couple of key definitions. I won't read through them all, but it's important for us to make sure that as we talk about the issues of diversity, inclusion, and equity, that we have a good understanding about what it is that we mean. These are clear definitions that you see up on the board, but what's more important is that these are definitions that have been tried and true over time. And yet we still want to be cognizant of the fact that these may evolve over time, but for purposes of today's webinar and purposes of probably future webinars, these definitions are still holding true. And so we want to make sure that as we talk through this presentation today, and as we, help the system to be guided by what it means to be equity minded, what it means to be inclusive in your practice and strategy. What does it mean to have a plan, a diversity plan? You can use these definitions to kind of ground that space and level set what's happening at your campuses as well. More specifically, as it relates to today's discussion around the anti-racism framework, the first thing we have to understand is, what is racism itself? And as you can see, the definition that we've adapted is really focusing on looking at how one dominant group has a power differential to carry out systematic policies that end up being discriminatory in terms of how they play out, in terms of the practices, in terms of shaping those cultures and beliefs and values that unfortunately create racist policies and practices. So it's really taking a look at how race is incorporated in where we and how we define ourselves foundationally from a systemic standpoint. And interestingly enough, when we talk about anti-racism, it's really the unpacking of that process and doing it in an active way to identify and eliminating those areas of racism by changing our systems, our structures, and our policies, practices, and attitudes so that the power differential is very much redistributed and shared equitably. So we're really talking about two real important concepts when we think about the anti-racism framework. This is around bringing equitability around power differentials, and also just really taking a look at where we started and where we want to go, and coming to terms, taking a look in our mirror, in our organizational mirror, to help us understand, what quite frankly hasn't worked, that's been creating these barriers for us to have these academic gaps. So we start with that defined perspective and that defined framework. I want to also kind of level set from the standpoint of ensuring that we understand as a system of what makes sense for us when we're talking about the non-negotiables. we are very much as an institution, as a system, want to make sure that we are including and having an inclusive environment. That starts with understanding that as a non-negotiable, there are some things that are just not tolerated. And so this statement really speaks into that. And that's, again, a baseline foundational perspective for you to consider. I'm pretty sure that if you've been at Minnesota State for a little while, the terminology of 1B1 comes into this play. But this is foundational for helping us to move up and above baseline policies and to really understand what it takes to have an inclusive environment. And finally, as we think about what's so important in this day and time, not just looking at the 1B1 policy or looking at what it takes for maintaining an inclusive environment, but what's happening in the right now. This was a statement that we looked at and originated almost a year ago. And it's hard to believe that we've been in the pandemic state for almost a year, but we really have. And yet this statement holds true in terms of what it takes for us to think about how we sit in this space, both in the current pandemic state, but also as we think about where we're going to go in a post-pandemic state. So these are all tied together with understanding what it takes to create a framework and a mindset that's going to move us into a better space in terms of addressing equity, in terms of becoming an anti-racist organization. So I just wanted to frame up more broadly what this is. We're talking about a lot of broad abstract terms, but when you break it down into what's necessary for us to think about these ideas, the first thing that comes to mind is really taking a courageous statement, a courageous action in education, understanding where and how we got here. So that's important for us to know, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. Understanding that at the baseline of this work, there is a lot of really good scholarship and really good perspectives when we think about critical race theory that helps us to educate ourselves, but it also helps to inform how we move forward as an institution and a mindset. And again, it has to go back to those foundational perspectives. Another perspective to consider, and this is just one of many, is looking at how we address the issue of stereotypes. Stereotypes, bias, those are all important components of understanding how and educating ourselves on how we want to activate a different type of mindset as we move forward with this ethos and framework. Second to that is looking at how we actually come across with dealing with conflict, because we know this is hard work. We know that there are going to be differing opinions. We know that there's going to be conflict about how to move forward in this framework. And so there's different pieces that to consider. We're not going to talk through all of this today, but this just gives you a broad-based perspective of some of the practices and mindsets that we need to consider. Being trauma informed, understanding what type of restorative practices are out there, and have a constant point of measure through being informed from different measures like campus climate. And finally, we can't do this work alone. As an institution, as campuses, we sit and live and breathe within our communities. And so it's so important. We'll talk about how the community connection becomes so much of an imperative, particularly for our students, for our faculty, for our staff. We know that those partnerships are so important for us to move forward this work. We want it creates a level of accountability within the campus, but it also creates a level of accountability within the community. And finally, it shows a higher level of commitment when we're thinking about activating and actually sustaining these values around an anti-racist and ethos framework. So with that, I'd like to turn the podium, the virtual podium, over to my colleague from St. Cloud Technical and Community College, Deborah Lee. She serves as the interim vice president for cultural fluency, equity, and inclusion at St. Cloud Tech, and has been a long standing supporter and educator in this area of anti-racism. So she's going to go through and give us a deeper dive perspective into what anti-racism means, particularly in the area of higher education.
Well, thank you, Andrea. I really appreciate your introduction, and what a pleasure it is to be here with all of you. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I want to talk about what anti-racism is and also what anti-racism is not. And anti-racism is actually about action, and it's all about action. And the very first action is becoming very conscious of who you are, knowing yourself. All change starts here. And I'm intentionally pointing at my heart. So all change starts here. It starts with me. And it starts with you. So really understanding who you are, what you know about yourself, the things that you thought you know, but you don't know where it came from. Figuring out some of those things, where did that ideal or that thought or that action even sometimes come from? Why am I reacting the way that I'm reacting? Why am I feeling the way that I'm feeling? So really getting to know yourself. It's action that acknowledges your own personal privileges. And all of us have some privileges. Some of us have a lot more privileges than others, but being able to simply acknowledge that, that's an action. It also provides for equitable opportunities for all people, action that provides equitable opportunities for all people, actions that change systems and the culture of organizations. And that's getting a little bit deeper when we start talking about changing system and the culture. But system and culture change is exactly what's needed. So those actions, actions that confronts the acts of racial discrimination and the complexities of systemic racism. And we'll be talking a little bit more as we go through about what some of those are. Actions that change personal racial biases. If we can go to the next slide. And as we look specifically at higher education and anti-racism in higher education, we're still talking about actions, actions that's more than the support for faculty and students of color. I'm not saying that faculty and students of color don't need support, they do. But I'm saying that it's actions that are also more than that. Um, it's action that does away with the deficit thinking when we're working and looking for solutions. It's action that provides education about the realities of white supremacy, power, and oppression, so that it's part of what we're teaching as well as part of what we're learning. It's action that drives conscious leaders to change organizational culture by overhauling policies and practices and procedures and being very intent about that. It's actions that call out and make clear white immunity, white fragility, and white privilege. And this is a tough one in our higher education institutions because it requires us to turn the mirror inward and really take a deeper look at ourselves and the way we react and respond um, as we are doing our anti-racism work. It's also action that establishes mutually accountable relationships with people of color and communities of color. And I have to pause just to say, when I talk about mutually accountable relationships, I'm really saying that you can tap me on my shoulder and say, Deborah, I want to talk to you about something, you know, that you said or did, and this is the way that it impacted what happened. But it also provides an opportunity for me to say, and I want to tap you on your shoulder. So that tapping is mutual. The honor and respect and the dignity that goes along with it is also mutual. Um, Also, it's action that addresses systemic racism inherent in our hiring and recruitment and retention practices. And it's action that eliminates discrimination in grading practices and policies. So again, it's turning the mirror inward and taking a much closer look at what we're doing on the policy side and also in the classroom in our courses. If we could move to the next slide, please. It's also action. And this is one of the places that we really have to get honest with ourselves. It's action that fully funds, staffs, and resources, offices of equity and inclusion. There is no single individual in any institution that can make all of the necessary changes that need to happen to achieve anti-racist goals in an institution. It takes a staff, it takes resources, it takes funding. And without that, we can make some progress, but making all the progress that we need to make in order for our students to be successful won't happen. And so we really have to get honest about the funding, about the staffing, and about the resources. It takes action that examines why groups and individuals are systemically oppressed and marginalized. Some of that happens long before they come to our institution, and our institutions merely continue to compound the problems rather than address the problems. It's actions that exposes discriminatory behaviors, whether they're behaviors of employees or students or even community members. Those behaviors are exposed. It's action that redistributes power equitably, that has been held by dominant groups across racial lines. It's actions that create ecosystems that achieve equity. And I want to say that this is probably one of the most important parts. Understanding how we interact and how we are dependent in our environments, in our communities, in our state, on each other.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Terrence Robertson. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'm the project director for diversity, equity, and inclusion at Minnesota State Colleges and Universities at their system office. And I've been with Minnesota State for about a year and a half.
Sorry, folks, we're having a brief logistical issue. We will iron that out. You all do continue.
Okay, thank you. And finally, it's action that teaches the historical realities of racism. So it's not something that continues to be kind of glossed over, but it is addressed directly in our courses, in our classes, and in our actions. Next slide, please. It's also action that increases access to people of color, students, and employees. It's action where the onus to adopt and change is not put on people of color. It's action where racial justice is part of the conversation. And again, not something that we try to avoid. It's action where our board of trustees and our presidents understand white supremacy in relationship to self and privilege. It's action where whites develop the stamina that allows for constructive engagement while facing difficult racial matters. So when the going gets tough or when things don't go the way that they think they would like for them to go, they don't just storm out the room, but they're able to sit in those places of discomfort and work through with the other people who are in the room, the issues that are coming up. It's also action that uplifts local organizations involved in anti-racism efforts. Let's go on to the next slide. And I kept this one short, but I tried to be very direct in saying that anti-racism is not training that teaches tolerance or inclusive excellence. Although those are very important trainings, that's not necessarily what anti-racism is about. And so often people will opt to do this kind of work, teaching about tolerance or inclusive excellence or cultural competency even, rather than really looking at the issues of racism, which are the root causes for why you would have to teach tolerance or cultural competence or inclusive excellence. It's not about creating white saviors or having white saviors. It's not about that at all. It really is about partnerships, learning to work together and everybody having some skin in the game, so to speak, to be doing the work and doing it in ways that uplifts everyone. It's not about the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory, and that's another one of those things that sometimes another tool and a very useful tool that people use, but it's not the work of anti-racism. Anti-racism work is not racist. And it's also not reverse racism. And there are some people that would try to bring that as an argument for what anti-racism is, but that's not what it is at all. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Mary Clifford at St. Cloud State.
Good morning. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm so glad to be having this conversation with us in the system in a broader context. St. Cloud State's been doing this work for several years. And in fact, my colleague who you just met, Deborah Lee, and I have been doing work at St. Cloud State campus. We just recently lost her to St. Cloud Technical and Community College, and we miss her terribly. But there's a lot that we have learned over the many years that we've been doing this work together. And so I wanted to just start with a little bit of information about our program. And a funny story that some of you may have heard already, but I want to just share quickly is I had been asked by someone, because I teach in the criminal justice department, and I had been asked if we could create some sort of focus on racism and hate crime, because criminal justice clearly needs that work, and the campus was looking for something. And I was told by the dean we didn't have enough money. And so I got a little bucky, and I sent something out to the faculty listserv, and I said, the dean says we don't have money, but if everybody sent me $1, we'd be able to afford it. And so I got $1 in my inbox over the time. That dollar came from Deborah Lee in a lovely folded envelope with her very scrolling, beautiful signature. And I thought, I've got to meet this person, Deborah Lee. And so we met after that, not too long after that. We had an invitation. She invited me to go to a training on anti-racism, but I get ahead of myself. I wanted to just let you know that St. Cloud State in around 1999 had, it feels weird even saying 1900s, it feels like a century ago, but we did have several campus climate surveys that had been done because of some anti-Semitism and because of some other kind of racist practices on our campus. And Roy Saigo, who was the president at the time, said, let's do environmental scans and see what we find. And so we had several environmental scans that we did in 1999. And Andrea, if you want to go ahead and move that slide forward, that'd be great. And so part of the work around that was kind of just seeing what was out there. And so the Faculty Association, at the request and in collaboration with President Saigo, put together what we call the Campus Committee on Diversity Education, the CODE Committee. And as a result of that work, Deborah was doing work at the national office. And I'm not sure if you can get both of us in here, but we'll invite Deborah, of course, back for comments. she and I wrote together a grant that funded initially the work for St. Cloud State's campus. But in 2001, it was that the Multicultural Issues Committee that Deborah was a part of had invited MCARI, the Minnesota Collaborative Anti-Racism Initiative, to come do a training. She invited me. I remember bringing my 2-year-old at the time to the hotel. We spent the weekend and we had a little bit of a battle bringing that back, but we thought this is what we want to take back to St. Cloud State. And so we had been in conversation with TOCAR, which was the University of Moorhead had teaching our campus against racism. And Phyllis and Amy at the time had been kind of in conversation with us about what they were doing. And so the president was very excited about the possibility of St. Cloud State joining that kind of broader effort to have something on campus that would address this issue of racism. And so, Andrea, please go ahead, the next slide. So in 2002, we received, Roden received, Deborah and I, a grant from Otto Bremer Foundation to create and train an anti-racism education leadership team. And so at the time, can you imagine, we had a vision for people coming from the community, but also people on campus, students, staff, faculty, administrators, and the community. And so we wanted 5 people from each of those sectors to come and join us on the leadership team. I think our first leadership team was 30 people. It was huge, right? And so we learned and it shifted, but at the same time, it was a place to start, and we were happy to have so many people interested in the programming. James Addington and Carmen Valenzuela, she worked with us on campus. I remember being huddled with Deborah in our office with them on speakerphone and she and I on speakerphone, and just having these conversations about, okay, so what do we do now? How do we do this? What do we think about? What are some of the ideas that we need to kind of blend into the initial vision, and how do we change and shift? So in 2004, the CARE team was commissioned by President Saigo. And of course, again, I mentioned the construction of the leadership team. We had week-long retreats and trainings and conversation and community building among the team members. And so there was a lot of thinking around how the team would operate, but there was a lot of ideology driving how we decided to move forward as we decided what we were going to be focusing on. One thing particularly, which I think warrants mention, is the goal was to look systemically, to look long range. I remember having a conversation with James, which I've teased him about since, that, you know, this is a 20-year mission, vision. And I think he meant getting the team organized and having the structure. I kind of thought we'd be done in 20 years, right? And so I know better now, but it's still ongoing. It will always be ongoing. We have a lot to do, and we have, once things change and shift, I think, just to say a side note, if you have the opportunity, particularly as a white person, to look at definitions of white supremacy culture, I think it's going to be very instructive, because, for example, just that analogy of being finished in 20 years, the idea that you're going to be finished with something suggests that there's an outcome end. And that sometimes can be an indicator of an ideology that's reflective of white supremacy culture. And in fact, sometimes those shifts and changes that we have are just shifts and changes, and then we'll shift and change again. It's not like we're headed to that one kind of pinnacle outcome. And I think I was disabused of that idea over time, but that's kind of what I came into the operation thinking, is that we would have an outcome and we could check the box in 20 years. So go ahead, Andrea, and shift that one more time, that we received the funding, we did the trainings, we created the leadership team. The other thing to notice, when President Saigo made the assignment, he did also assign a budget line, which became really critical. Some of the initial leadership teams that had been created either didn't have money, or they were grant to grant operational, and that became not sustainable over time. I think one of the reasons that St. Cloud State's Community Anti-Racism Education Leadership Team is still operational at this moment is because a person was identified to be the lead. And in fact, initially I was assigned halftime, Deborah was assigned halftime, and then there were some structural changes on campus, which made it a little bit difficult to sustain that. Plus, it was hard for us to keep in touch with each other and also teach classes. And so a decision was made that Deborah would take the lead position. I'd go back to the classroom, and that way we would have the momentum with kind of a driving finer point, someone who was really being able full-time to focus on the work that we had visioned as a team. And so in 2005, Deborah was appointed as primary lead. And then I want to just move us forward. I don't know why I put these in. I was looking through, Andrea, if you want to move that slide, yeah. I put this was the University Chronicle when we were finally commissioned as a leadership team in 2004. And President Saigo, I think, was very pleased about that. I found this letter, an email that Deborah and I put together to President Saigo in terms of the CARE initiative. And it was just kind of fun to see that, gosh, however many years ago, and to have the idea, I guess, of this 20 years later, and still going strong, still kind of figuring out how this new transition with Deborah taking the new position and us rethinking what St. Cloud State's going to look like moving forward. It was just fun to kind of look back and have these, I don't know, memorabilia for me. So thank you for indulging me by looking at these slides. So Andrea, please go ahead. In about 2005, Deborah, as a full-time operation, fully developed the 4-hour CARE workshop, Understanding Racism and Anti-Racism Organizing. We still do that workshop to this day. We do probably 4 or 5 each semester, depending, that are open to the public. And we also have operations in particular departments. They ask for us to come work with particular groups. And then the last thing to say about that is it's always open. You can see here that 2006 and 2007, we had 14 4-hour CARE workshops. And so our mission vision at that time was to get everybody on campus on the same page with a definition of anti-racism, with even kind of an understanding of what racism is, more or less the interrupting protocol of actionable anti-racist practice. I just want to mention, because I want to make sure we have time for Deborah to offer her thoughts. She clearly was the primary lead during the bulk of this work. The HEART Collaborative was a higher education anti-racism team, note the acronym, that we put together. It was operational out of MnState for a while, and then personnel changes and a shift in priorities at the moment produced a reduction in that support. And so we did not persist with that particular initiative, but we were able to fund a report that kind of did some qualitative and quantitative research about the impact of anti-racism education. We were also very intentionally trying not only to educate and make people aware of terms and concepts, we were also trying to really identify ways to do strategic analysis within particular areas within St. Cloud's institution. And so at some point we moved added an additional kind of operation focused on the classroom work. And so you'll see that in the RPAC, Anti-Racism Pedagogy Across Curriculum Initiative. And then, of course, we just kept ongoing with the trainings that we were doing, the 4-hour trainings. We would invite people. President Potter, when he was here, had given Deborah kind of a directive to move those trainings out into the community and see how we could help build a bigger base or bigger footprint of the anti-racism initiative. And if you want to flip one more slide, Andrielle, that the piece I just want to say about the RPAC work, again, this is a very intensive deep dive focus on curriculum. And we intentionally try to integrate anti-racist practice in the classroom, shifting the focus to a community-oriented analysis or a community-oriented dynamic, as opposed to kind of sage on the stage, just as a simple idea. The other thing is just looking at how we teach in higher education and actually being honest about how education can be exclusive or inclusive, and the idea of traditional pedagogical methods being exclusive and not inclusive was a central component for the motivation to bring together the pedagogy across the curriculum piece. Strategies for online education is kind of evolving and trying to figure out how we do that and do that well. The other piece that we've been trying to make sure happens is this community of practice. And so the RPAC has been operational, I think, Deborah, you'd have to correct me, I think 9 years we've done RPAC. And I think that the idea that every time a group of people goes through that program, they're included in the community of practice. And that is an ongoing 4 or 5 times a semester touching base to see how people are doing and just to mitigate any questions or concerns about the classroom changes that they're making. And the other piece to say about that is what kind of pushback, if any, they're getting from outside the classroom, because sometimes the systems and structures will create obstacles for faculty, even integrating something as simple as talking about a certain sector of a community that hasn't been discussed before, and people being challenged by content changes that they're making in the classroom. So I wanted to just also, the next slide, please, mention just a few things that have connected, I think, the campus community and the greater St. Cloud community. It was mentioned before that the community connections are so critical, and we noted throughout the Community Anti-Racism Education Initiative process that when the people on campus, maybe the staff and the faculty, even students, would get a little bit sluggish, the people in the community were the ones who were saying, oh no, you're not slowing down on this because these are the important things. And they would absolutely be pushing harder as we tried to decide next steps and how we wanted to move forward. So the community involvement was critical. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, there was intentional effort to make sure that if a company or an agency, an organization in the community was wanting access to the 4-hour workshop or to a particular strategic response within the organizational structure, that was made available. And there were, we still have ongoing conversations about how compensation happens, who gets paid, how we get paid, and then how we make sure we can afford to offer those programs and maintain this as a sustaining program. So Create Community did also, it was a community group that evolved and did training with James and Carmen as we were starting the CARE initiative on campus. Conversations on race in St. Cloud happen every fall. This is an ongoing annual event. The MLK Breakfast, I think Deborah is by far, I want to say almost single-handedly responsible for bringing some of those programs together, but then just again, countless trainings in the community and countless presentations of data and information analysis, trying to get, we did some group dynamics and did some focus group research and presented that, talked to students about how they were experiencing campus, tried to incorporate that work into the work that we were doing broadly. And then the only other thing I want to say is I've been an academic my whole entire career. I'm not sure, I'll let Deborah speak for herself, of course, but one of the things I want to say about the work we did together, Deborah's a dancer. If you don't know that about her, I don't think she hides it. I'm surprised she's been sitting still this long, but she is a mover and she likes to move and she flows in her work. And you can see that in the work that she's done with us on campus. I apologize for the sun, it's a little glary. We have, I think, one of the things that I know for sure is as an academic exercise, this was very hard. I think Deborah's history and background in dance was instructive, if not critical, for again, evolving us into a very fluid kind of, if this doesn't work, let's try that. And if this doesn't work, let's try that. Whereas sometimes people see obstacles and then don't move forward. I think Deborah's like, oh, there's an obstacle. How do we flow around it? I mean, there was just kind of this integrated way of how she visioned. And I do think that there is something to be said. This, you can say it's all on me, Deborah, you may disagree completely, but I feel like her ability to kind of flow in the face of what might be seen as obstacles that would stop other people helped us keep moving forward when we didn't see a smooth or clear path, perhaps. And so I just wanted to offer that. I think sometimes we can over-intellectualize things to the point of our own demise. And I saw that in many occasions when Deborah and I were working together. So Deborah, I'm sorry, I kind of ran all over. If you have thoughts, please.
That's okay. There's just a couple of things I want to add. And first of all, that our mission as an anti-racism um, organization within the university was to build a lasting anti-racism institution. So that was our main goal from the very beginning. And we wanted to do that in every area of the institution. So in terms of what goes on in the classroom, in terms of our policies and practices, and procedures, in terms of having new and different kinds of relationships within the institution, as well as outside, external to the institutions, developing new relationships, learning as an institution, how do we become accountable to communities of color, accountable to our students of color, accountable to our parents of our students of color, accountable to the businesses of color that are in our community. How do we become accountable to those communities? And as Mary said, we started with nothing. And one of the things that helped us more than anything else were the interconnected relationships that we developed with other institutions who were also doing the work at that time. So the Heart Collaborative was critical to our development. And I can't tell you how many times we had conversations, you know, I'm on the phone, you won't believe what happened today at St. Cloud State. I'm not sure what I'm going to do, you know, and they would say, okay, we'll take a breath and let's just walk through it. Let's just talk through it. Let's figure it out. And from that, I gained the confidence when someone came in my office and say, you won't believe what happened in my department today. And sometimes they would be in tears and they would make me cry. And I'd put a box of a tissue between us. And we're both sitting there pulling tissue out. And finally, I'd look at him and I'd say, okay, we're going to cry for 10 more minutes. I'm putting this on the clock. And after that, we're going to figure out how to make sure this never happens again on our campus. And we would. And it was that kind of relationship building and interconnectedness, trying to create that ecosystem that I was talking about earlier, that was really critical. And the final thing that I just want to say is that I also think it's really important to intentionally build other leaders as we do this work, intentionally develop other leaders. I can't tell you how many times Mary would say, oh, I can't do that. That's Deborah. Oh, I can't do that. I can't do a workshop. I can't be the person in front. I can't. And I kept encouraging and saying, yes, you can. And let's do it together. And how can I help you? What do you need? How can I support? Part of being an organizer of anti-racism also is having those people that are doing the work feel like it's theirs. So it's not about me, it's not mine. I realize the importance of having others own this work. And I think it's one of the things that helps St. Cloud's longevity.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I think that was really a good, a good, and Mary, thank you all so much for a really good, rich presentation. What I think comes out of this presentation are key themes around starting with a vision and being able to sustain it and knowing that it's a journey. This is very much how this framework is intended to work. It's not a flash in the pan. It's not something that we want to make as kind of the cool thing now. And the reason I wanted to incorporate St. Cloud State's components and as we move into our next couple of speakers is the fact that there's a key theme with Minnesota State that we've really kind of been working on this before it got cool. And that's what I'm really happy to see in terms of that sustainability and the opportunity for Minnesota State and campuses within Minnesota State to think about what that means wherever you are on the continuum. So thank you again, Mary. Thank you again, Deborah. And as we move into our next campus perspective, I wanted to introduce Dr. Jay Williams. Dr. Jay Williams is on faculty at Minneapolis Community and Technical College. He has served as the campus or lead diversity officer there for quite a few years and has a great perspective that he's going to bring to us about how this work got started and where its current state and where it's going for Minneapolis College. So Jay, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Andriel, for bringing me in and supporting this work. And also thank you to Clyde Pickett, who talked to me initially about this work, and to Mary and Deborah for saying yes to joining this. I'm very happy. So I'm going to take much of the next 15 minutes and give you an overview of what happened at Minneapolis College over about the last half decade. And in doing that, I'll cover a portion of time where it was President Avelino Mills Novoa, and then President Sharon Pierce as well. Now, in 2015, I was serving as the coordinator for the African American Education Empowerment Program, which was housed on campus, provided meals, provided tutoring. I think we were in 13, 14 subjects at our height, and served a lot of students and was very important to the students who were coming in there. And it was also just a couple of years after the school had been basically beaten up in the newspapers for poor success rates with students of color, particularly with Black males. So there was a sensitivity around these issues. And as I was working out there, some mornings President Avelino would appear and we'd have our chit chats. And basically, the data I have in front of you kind of shows the early part of this last decade. And you can see that Minnesota has at that time, one of the largest disparities in household incomes from the mainstream to Black. And you can see that our gaps, our education gaps, start very early. We can see differences in 4th grade and 8th grade. And our graduation rates were also, unfortunately, disparate as well. Andriel, if you could move on, that'd be great. Thank you. Now, when we took the focus from the larger disparities to the school itself, we can see that we had a female majority. We had a majority that were eligible to receive Pell Grants. Most of the students, or 56.3%, identified as people of color, over a quarter first gen. 75% of our students were considered underrepresented. And as of 2016, 86% of those students that attended college each year in Minnesota, and 38% of the students enrolled had transferred from another institution, and then 7% were PSEO. More than 70% of our students were part-time. If we can move on. Andrew, please. Thank you. So the moment that really catalyzed us to get into action was the police killing of Jamar Clark. Many of you probably remember it. It was of massive importance to our students. Many of whom were upset, not focusing on their academics. And about 9 a.m., I got a call from President Avelino. I came to his office and he said, Jay, if you're listening to KMOJ, which I had been, they were saying we were one bullet away from being Ferguson, and was this it? Of course, today, we know that one of the points that enabled this kind of, that enabled the releasing of these emotions from African Americans was in June. But back in 2015, it was Jamar Clark. So I worked on something called the Minneapolis College Student Letter. for 2 weeks. And we also brought the students in. They were free to come. Nobody was enforced or enticed. And asked them, well, what are your concerns? And they produced a long list. And cultural competency was there, the diversity of the workforce in pockets and as an overall. And that letter became part of how we organized our movement moving forward. And these students were very powerful. Esther Haynes there has been acknowledged by the governor, Ronnie Russell Bayell, Laurel Clara Flores, Amarani Hanapa Sarabia, and then Amelia Avalos Gonzalez, who is the executive director of UNIDOS, working on the rights of undocumented people. Andrea, if you could move us forward, I'd be really happy. Thank you. And it was also a moment in which Black Lives Matter activity was kind of peaking. University of Missouri's president had been fired once the football players joined the Black Lives Matter movement. And all of this added up to us knowing that these conditions were affecting our students and we had to address them. So about 70 people came together for the first meeting in a large room to create the Minneapolis College Strategic Diversity Plan. Now, many had input, but by the end, we were 6 of us or so that wrote it. And part of what comes out of that is the formation of the Equity and Inclusion Committee structure. Hundreds of people wanted to address these issues and were in their own ways. But here we were giving them an opportunity to build something. And our basic organization is that we had a steering committee that was co-chaired by our CHRO and myself, and really overlooked what all the other committees were doing. Now, inclusive pedagogy and curriculum was 2 subcommittees which we emerged together after a year, led by Derek Lindstrom, Lisa Bergen, and really others that were doing great work too. And some of the beautiful things that Minneapolis College now offers would grow out of that subcommittee. In inclusive facilities and partnerships, we were looking at, are we involved in the community? Do we have healthy relationships with the right people? And how do we use our space? Is it in a way that enforces student dignity and supports their positive understanding of self, or is it really inequitable? Then we had institutional cultural fluency. I had to sunset them maybe 2 years ago, and they really initially were highly effective as I was the interim CDO, and they kind of guided me, discussed all of our questions and issues at that time. Then inclusive communications and policies began to review both policies and comment on public communications from the school. The Dr. King subcommittee was kind of shepherded in, and it took me quite a while not to be the one running that day. And then culturally responsive advising led by Juana Zayak, and I know Nanette Masagi also contributed largely there. And they looked at appreciative advising and different models and created their own model that was based on the students that we attracted to Minneapolis College. And that is now being spread, which we'll talk about a little bit at the end. And then I just wanted to mention at this moment, I was the initial advisor for the Star Scholars Avellino Mills Novoa Fellowship, which supported undocumented students with all tuition and fees paid and a little bit of money for books. And that would become important as we begin to build the Equity and Inclusion Division over the next few years. Andriel, if you can move on, I'd be grateful. Okay, so equity and inclusion work groups and efforts. What are some of the things we do? we did the IDF. Now, it might not be part of anti-racism work, but it does get you looking at self and thinking about how do I perceive and how does my cognition change when I'm confronted or thinking about those that I see as different. Nanette Masagi is a talented coach, one of the most experienced coaches in the state. And when I left, she was, I think we were over 30% of the workforce had done it. Now, we also decided to partner with the mindfulness practitioners. We hosted a large conference, over 130 people from around the system attended. And that was a strategic step in this setting at Minneapolis College, where equity work is both embraced, but also feared by others. How could we increase our scope and our reach? So we partnered with them, and that was continuing, and I believe it still is. Then the anti-racist pedagogy across the curriculum. We brought in Deborah and Mary. Rebecca would do much on our home front with that. We've put several cohorts of faculty through the RPAC training, and we also had an anti-racist administrator training. We had 30-some people come, 23 administrators from around the system. And then it's not listed here, but just as importantly, we had Deborah and Mary come down and run a support group for our equity practitioners. Of course, we're feeling pushback from the anti-racist approaches and techniques they were using. Other things that we did is the Out from the Shadows of Minneapolis, Power, Pride, and Perseverance at a Northern Community College book, which really takes the stories of our students, their narratives, and presents them in a way so that people have an understanding based in a person's actual life, rather than the stereotypes, rather than what's said about downtown or about Latin men or Latin women, Black men, Black women, Native men and women, and poor white working folks as well. Now, Equity by Design, we came in before it was full blown. We did a number of things. I pulled data to see who was getting into courses that were full. We found out 2 or more races was overrepresented. We looked at which ethnic groups were had which percentage of the financial holds. We looked at the gaps, the success gaps in courses, and began to sit down with the academic departments and the professors and discuss them. We also needed to launch these community advisory boards. That was a lot of work. Myself, Nanette Masagi, Rosa Shannon. We did it for the African American, the Latinx, the Native American community. As of when I left, we hadn't launched the Asian American community, but maybe someone who's in attendance might know if they had. We also revitalized, brought back the Minneapolis College Powwow after maybe 15 years on the shelf. And then one of the most exciting things is the Culturally Responsive Pedagogy Institute. I don't know that that's actually its name, at least I hadn't named it when I was there. But she's taking cohorts of faculty through very intensive, 50-some hours over the year of time in the classroom with work that's done on your, almost like you're taking a graduate course. And actually it's, there's a version of it, a 3-day version on the system website. I don't know, maybe Andriel knows if that's still open. And then the Community Healing Collaborative. You know, part of what happened here is when I replaced Whitney Stewart Harris, an incredibly talented person who took a singular approach. He led trainings, he brought a speaker in and spoke with them, but he hadn't really pushed the work systemically, like to hire a director, to form a committee, to form work groups. So I had the same budget he did at $28K a year. We raised a little over $400,000 in the time I was there. And much of that was due to Katrina, her work with some of our community partners that were brought in by Vice President Troop. And they were doing wonderful work when I left. We had just done a culturally responsive mental health forum all day long, and there were credit for professionals who needed to show that they were earning credit in their field. And then finally, I'd say the communities of practice around RPAC and CRP, so coming out of Lisa's work and then out of the RPAC work, and they met. I would make it to 15, 20 minutes of a meeting when I could, but it helped to make sure that we were going through the organizational change, the culture change where this type of work is possible. Andrea, if you could move on, I'd be grateful. Okay, so since my June departure, I'm sure many, many other things have happened. But I'd like to think of my time there as creating the space for truly anti-racist work to occur. Some of the things that have happened, I asked for it many times, didn't get it, but they dropped the term chief not long after I left. And now, instead of a CDO, it's the VP of Equity and Inclusion, and it's been, they've done the position that's slightly higher as well. The Equity Gap Initiative is looking at the gaps and figuring out, well, how can we get our faculty to make it important to close these gaps? Equity by Design is now framed explicitly as being anti-racist. Culturally relevant advising training has launched, and that committee is getting out and speaking to the advisors and providing training. Culturally responsive inclusion training brings in a number of students, Julian Bellamy, for example, to also provide these kind of trainings for our faculty and staff. Oh, and also we've had the living room conversations, creating community virtually in this COVID times we're in. And the E&I staff is now doing tons of training for the rest of the workforce. So I'm very happy and proud that they've gone in this direction. I thank you for your time. I've gone over by 2 minutes. So that is, in a quick nutshell, Minneapolis College over the last half decade on a journey towards equity and towards being an anti-racist institution. Thank you all for listening.
Well, thank you, Jay, and we really appreciate your look at kind of the longevity of the work that's been happening in Minneapolis campus, and we look forward to keeping you engaged in this work from putting back on your professorial hat. So we're looking forward to continuing to engage with you as we move forward with this work. Wanted to give definitely ample amount of time for our final speaker, Wendy Roberson. Wendy serves as the Dean of Student Success, Equity, and Inclusion at St. Paul College. And Wendy is coming into this as we kind of look at the full circle perspective around how the anti-racism framework actually can be not only a part of the community perspective, but really as we're thinking about from a strategic perspective, how this gets infused into the framework of a strategic plan for an institution. So with that, I will turn it over to Wendy. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So last summer, the leadership of St. Paul College made the commitment to becoming an anti-racist and trauma-informed institution. And I'll share with you a little bit of information about what got us to this point and also how we plan to move forward. We are a community and technical college. 65% of our students identify as students of color. 87% of first-time and full-time students receive some form of of financial aid. We have an average age of our students of 24 years old, and 61% of our students identify as first-generation students. Along with that, about 24% of our college employees also identify as people of color. The last 2 years at St. Paul College has consisted of peaks and valleys for the college. During the 2018 Higher Learning Commission accreditation reaffirmation process, concerns regarding the campus climate for faculty and staff were highlighted. In response, beginning in May of 2019, college employees participated in a 5-month college climate assessment consisting of formal interviews and focus groups. Also during this time, there was a leadership transition at the college, and the departure of the previous president for some was a welcomed and much needed change, and for others, it made the climate even more uncomfortable. Can you go on to the next slide? As a result of the assessment, recommendations were shared with the college, encouraging us to rebuild employee trust, emphasize the importance of collaborative work, and continue to deepen the equity work that we're doing as an institution. After receiving these recommendations, the college launched multiple initiatives to focus on improving the campus culture, beginning with the Campus Climate Work Group with representation across bargaining units. The college also launched a Be Well program, which is the college's well-being program. There were also departmental trainings offered on intercultural communication and division professional development programs on creating an inclusive workplace. As the college focused on its internal climate, there was also attention given to situations that were happening locally and globally that were impacting all of us, including the COVID pandemic and the murder of George Floyd. The combination of the global pandemic and the murder of George Floyd highlighted, the murder of George Floyd, as we all remember, was just one of several racialized incidents that happened last year that received quite a bit of national and international media attention. These things highlighted the trauma and systemic racism experienced daily by members of the St. Paul College community, particularly those of color. It was at that time that we embraced our commitment to being anti-racist and trauma-informed. Next slide. We merged the process and the practice of being trauma-informed with anti-racism because we felt it was critical for our community. We needed to understand that prior to, but especially since COVID and the murder of George Floyd, that members of our community have or were currently experiencing trauma, and that trauma can unconsciously influence how a person shows up in our classrooms, in our offices, engages with us in person or online, and interacts with a person in authority. Because of the trauma-informed commitment, members of our community will collectively support a culture of safety, trust, empowerment, cooperation, and choice. So following the commitment to becoming anti-racist and trauma-informed, a 21-person work group was developed representing areas from across the institution. The work group identified priorities for the college to pursue over the next 5-year period connected to the commitment. Next slide, please. The framework for that group was to develop something that demonstrated a clear commitment to being anti-racist and trauma-informed, that would develop and value the contributions of members of our St. Paul College community, would support shared governance, would increase the representation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color at all levels within the institution, would adapt trauma-informed practices throughout the college, and also expand the college's interaction and engagement in anti-racist activity and also engagement in the Black and Indigenous people of color communities around St. Paul. So we came up with a plan that has 7 different priority areas, and I will run very quickly through each one of those. So priority number 1, the next slide, focuses on our institutional structure. The purpose of this priority is to demonstrate the institution's commitment of St. Paul College becoming an anti-racist and trauma-informed institution, and to internally embed this commitment through vertical and horizontal structures at the institution. Each one of the bullet points that you see on this slide has multiple bullet points below it, but we were intentional in saying that we needed to make sure that our commitment was present from the top down in the mission and vision of the institution, in the way that we supported and we will support shared governance and decision-making, that we will also make sure that we have the resources available to do this work and include the engagement, the anti-racist engagement in St. Paul communities. Priority number 2 addresses our policies and procedures. And this will help us develop a process for reviewing and adapting all of our policies at the college through an anti-racist and trauma-informed lens. So we will be auditing and reviewing every single institutional policy. And as you know, that will be a very ambitious undertaking, but we are ready for it. We will also conduct routine data-informed policy evaluations and reports, including the racial impact data for each one of the policies. The next priority focuses on the employment aspect. The purpose of this priority is to attract, hire, and retain Black, Indigenous people of color as faculty and staff at the institution, and to develop an employee base of anti-racist and trauma-informed professionals. We see that it is critical that we embed an anti-racist and trauma-informed commitment throughout the employment process. This means that it will be embedded from the moment we choose to create a new position all the way through the exit interview when a person chooses to end their relationship with the college. We will also intentionally increase the recruitment and retention of employees of color at the institution. The next slide talks about providing programming that raises the awareness and promotes dialogues to facilitate difficult conversations relating to anti-racism and trauma-informed issues. It is really important to us that we don't just put this within our system and our structures, but that every employee of the institution has a personal understanding of their role in promoting the college's commitment to being anti-racist and trauma-informed. So we will be requiring all employees to participate in institutionally provided training. We will also have additional optional opportunities for people to engage in this work. We are including it in our faculty development days and our faculty and staff in service. We actually have an in-service program scheduled for just a few weeks from now, and the entire day is dedicated to anti-racism and trauma-informed education for employees. The next priority, priority number 5, focuses on finance and resources. As we all know, the quickest way to ensure that a plan will fail is to not have the resources necessary for that plan to be successful. So we are embedding this in our process for developing budgets, identifying financial resources that can support all of this. We are also looking at the way that we have faculty who are hired and that we follow the contract language for faculty ratios when it comes to full-time faculty in regards to adjunct. And we are also going to be intentionally developing a plan to increase and sustain the support of BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, people of color owned businesses within St. Paul College, or within the St. Paul community. We cannot be St. Paul College and not be involved in the St. Paul community. The next priority focuses on the educational experience. And so we are providing mandatory and optional training for faculty. We are also making sure that the anti-racist trauma-informed pedagogy is involved and included throughout the entire academic experience. We want any student who comes to our institution and every student who comes to our institution to be touched by this commitment. And so we will also be expanding the curriculum and looking at our academic and classroom policies and reviewing all of them with an anti-racist and trauma-informed lens. And the last but not least priority is that it is very important that we continue with our institutional research. We have to make sure that as we are doing this work, that we are analyzing and assessing what we're doing to see if what we're doing is actually working, and then also to be able to identify where there may be gaps. There may be areas that we haven't touched on yet that we need to put attention to. We are also making sure through the second bullet of developing a process to prevent the weaponization of data, we are making sure that when we collect our information, when we collect our data, that first off, we are not using it as a way to hide or avoid the work. And we are also not using it as a way to target any particular population and punish anyone. We want to make sure that the data that we collect is data that is useful and data that is appropriately used. And so I know that I went through all 7 priorities very quickly, but I wanted to make sure that we had time for the question and answer.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and thank you to all of our speakers this morning. This has been just a rich information and rich information sharing, and we really want to thank all of you for all of your hard work thus far. This is really a culmination of quite a few conversations that have occurred over the last couple of months, and it has just been a joy getting to know Mary, Deborah, Wendy, and Jay on a more personal level, but to also hear of the passion that they are working, you know, with fulfilling this work. And the good news is they're not going away too soon with respect to ensuring that we work on these pieces from at a campus level, but also how this helps to inform how we think about advancing this work at a system level as well. So with that in mind, first I want to give a big thank you to the panelists and to my team for, we were wonderfully, and I'm excited, we had so many really good questions in the Q&A space. So I really want to thank you for answering some of those questions as we were moving along. But there were a couple of questions around that I wanted to just highlight. And one question in particular is around the weaponization of data. And so I know that and I just will read the question real quick. If I go, goodness, I'm trying to see if I can find it. Can you provide an example of weaponization of data to help us look for and counter when it occurs? And this comes out of the presentation that Wendy just gave. So Wendy?
Sure. I think one way that data can be weaponized is when we use it to unfairly target populations. For example, to say that, gosh, there's so many different examples that we could throw out there. I'm just trying to find a really good one. I think one way that data can definitely be weaponized is when we look at, for example, students who are being successful in the classroom. And so sometimes we may see that one population isn't being as successful in the classroom, and so all of a sudden we want to exclude them from that class. That is a way that data can be weaponized. Instead of looking a little deeper to find out, okay, so why are students not successful in the classroom? Is the content that's being utilized in the classroom culturally inclusive? Is the syllabus clearly explained? And so oftentimes just stopping with the numbers and not digging deeper is one way that data can be weaponized.
And I'll allow my my other panelists to chime in on this as well, as I know that's a key component of how we're looking at trying to understand and unpack issues around data and its infrastructure and its use, not only at the campus level, but also from a systemic perspective. So if any of the other panelists have perspective that they'd like to share, I'd welcome and open the floor.
I just want to say quickly, this is Mary from St. Cloud State. The one concern I have, and this is broad, I think that You know, counting students in classrooms can also be a way to kind of minimize and set aside programs that are very valuable programs and offer the kind of diversity and exposure to multiple kinds of different programming that we're looking for. But because the numbers don't match what we're hoping to get in terms of, again, I would argue a kind of white supremacist, more money is better. So the classes that get more students are better classes, that kind of thing. We have to think strategically about how we decide to focus our own kind of core curriculum and what those classes look like. So that's just another example. That's a really basic one, but sometimes I think we forget that the qualitative components matter as much as the raw numbers.
That's very true. I would also say that sometimes we look at, we don't have a lot of people using the service, therefore we need to get rid of it, or we won't have a lot of people attending, whether it's for students or for employees. We may not have a lot of people attending a specific training, so we don't necessarily need to do that training. Let's put the funding elsewhere. And we all know that oftentimes the activities that receive the least number of participants are sometimes the activities that push us the most. So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it just because we have low numbers. And then also some communities won't give you the data. Oftentimes I hear, well, what does the data say? Well, there are some things, for example, if we're talking about incidents of racism or discrimination, there are some communities who struggle with putting in a report because they have historically put in reports and they've seen nothing done. So you may not have the numbers to back up the need. And so that's another example of data being weaponized.
You know, I think I'd just add that the weaponization of the data was already in place in many ways. So we take the gaps in terms of educational outcomes. Many faculty would talk about the school districts not preparing the students. Maybe the idea was there was something wrong with the students. For myself and some of admin, it was like we have to do better. But once data becomes an important part of the conversation, I think many weaponizations are just bound to happen.
I would agree. I mean, I think that the one thing, and one of the good news is that at the system level, we are having those conversations around what it means to think about data, particularly demographic data, both in the student and in the employee space. What does it mean to collect the data? What does it mean to disaggregate the data? And what does it mean to really interpret the data? So, you know, we're working, our office and others are working very closely with our Equity 2030 Strategic Coordinator, Terry Hines, who has a really rich history with institutional research, but we're also working with our institutional research partners as well in trying to understand how to think about ways of working with data. So to that end, one of the initiatives that is coming out of our office is the Equity by Design work, which really is focused on taking a deeper dive look at data disaggregation, understanding how to review it with an equity lens, and then really doing some deep dives into what you can actually do in terms of creating that action plan with a data-informed presence and an equity-minded presence as well. So I think these are really, really good pieces that we want to all incorporate as we move forward in this work. I note that we just have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to open up the opportunity for panelists if you had any final words that you wanted to leave with in today's webinar. Any words, final words of wisdom? You've been giving us such wonderful nuggets of information.
Andrea, I'd like to pose a question to the panelists, and I know we were tight on time, but can you offer any words around how to engage your senior leadership in this work or bring them on board?
This is Deborah at St. Cloud Technical and Community College. I think that it's engaging senior leadership. They have to want to as well. Just like we say, our faculty have to want to engage. Our senior leadership also has to want to engage. And more I'm finding that they want to because they must. They recognize that we cannot continue as we have, and that doing the same thing over and over is not getting new results. And so they are looking for and finding ways to engage that I have not seen before, which is really exciting.
I just want to add that we created notice of the descriptions, job descriptions for presidents and for folks, you know, the conversations when they were at hire was, what do you think of anti-racism? And some of those conversations, Deborah, you probably have some things to say about, you know, tapping a candidate on the shoulder. What do you know about anti-racism and how are you going to integrate anti-racism into your administrative practice, right? And so if they were like, the what, you know, then it was impact, right? It had some influence on our hires for presidential candidates, for example. So I think it's kind of pre-planning and organizing the advance work as much as it is. They also went through our entire presidential cabinet on multiple occasions, have gone through the longer term, the more deep dive of the anti-racism work that we're talking about on campus. So there's some direct connectivity. And you know, it's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that this is the good news is we're finding, and the feedback we're getting is very, very positive. I think that you know, as our office engages with senior leaders, as we're engaging with cabinet members, presidents, provost, board of trustees, the work clearly is not being led or felt with any significant resistance. I think there's a lot of work to be done around understanding how this work can be incorporated from a strategic standpoint, which is really exciting because all of the campuses that have been highlighted today have really had some deep thought processes around this. So whether it's in identifying the work from a strategy perspective of incorporating it with a larger strategic plan, or, you know, providing the resources to maintain a certain funding mechanism to incorporate the training of itself within the structures of the campus and within the community. These are all ways that we're seeing the expansion of this work actually being incorporated into what I would call the operational space of an institution. So with that, I want to again thank the panelists, Deborah Lee, Mary Clifford, Wendy Roberson, Jay Williams. You all have been a tremendous treasure trove of information today. And as for what's next, we are going to continue these conversations. We're going to be working with in the Office of Equity and Inclusion to provide a landing page that can provide some resources to give perspective and work around the issue of anti-racism. We'll also be collaborating with our system partners, Academic and Student Affairs, for example, in their faculty development, and Catherine Ford's work with the Network Education Development Network. Has equity and inclusion coordinators that we've been very, very much connected with. They are doing some diligent work around how to incorporate anti-racist practices within the pedagogy and within teaching practices. So there's more to come in that space as well. So thank you all for giving us a few minutes of your time this morning. We appreciate you. We will come back to you with some further guidance. And by the way, we will have more in our competency series. There'll be more forthcoming this semester. We have 4 more presentations that we are planning. So we will be sending that out shortly.